Anastasia, looking at the world today, the question arises as to with which dominant in consciousness people come up with political and religious theories and introduce them to the masses? Rigdon, this is a substantial question. Those who want to find the answer to it should take a closer look at modern society and its dominating values. After all, sacrifices to the single animal mind have remained. Pride is eating people. They are dominated and easily manipulated by the animal nature, as a structure unit of the animal mind, instilling pride for an individual mind. And the saddest thing is that modern people are so full of these qualities of the animal nature that they do not notice the obvious, convincing each other of one and the same, looping of thoughts, that the spiritual world does not exist and that there is only the material, visible world they can see, paradise in the body. That is, people perceive what is foreign to their spiritual nature as the truth, circulating the information with which priests and politicians fuel their worldview. As a result, the majority in society have chosen to live by laws of the animal mind, for example, worship and imitation of the strongest one in this material world, whether these are people, countries, organizations, secret orders, priests, or politicians, fighting to achieve greater power, pursuing only material goals. It is sufficient to observe how divided people are among themselves in the world, how politicians and priests launch wars for the sake of their profits and power, drawing up contracts in blood and offering up millions of human lives as a sacrifice for their own profit, success, and the well-being of their descendants. How huge crowds of people are quickly wound up to aggression and are controlled by the collective animal mind like herds of animals. How people, trying to make it in life, bend over backwards in front of higher management in order to get something more, something better for themselves. They give bribes, make deals with their consciousness for the sake of material benefits, guarantees of success for their business, and a better material provision for their posterity. And in old age, they are ready to make any sacrifice in order to get health and former power over someone. In short, they live by the harsh laws of matter, of the single animal mind. After all, in order to get something in the material world, you have to give away something valuable. This is the point of making a sacrifice in the domain of the animal mind. So man gives away the most precious thing he has, that for which he was born into this world. He is wasting into nothingness the power that is intended for reaching eternity on achieving a short-lived, fleeting illusion, on what tomorrow will turn to ash, and for him, it will be a crash. He is wasting the power of his attention, the deepest feelings of sincere inner faith intended for the spiritual development throughout his life, for uniting his personality with the soul, and salvation in eternity in order to attain temporary, foolish dreams of power, health, wealth, and success in the material world. Thus, in relation to himself and his soul, a person, in fact, commits a crime, which burdens him for a long time, including after death of the physical body. After all, nothing can be worse than this. That is why people suffer during their lives, without even understanding the true reason for the torment of their spirit, writing everything off to external factors and the environment. But a choice is a choice. Whatever a person gives preference to in his transient life is what he gets. As I have already mentioned, Jesus Christ said, "According to your faith be it unto you." Priests have, of course, turned him into goods sold by the peace for themselves, the atoning sacrifice for the sins of mankind. But Jesus Christ was and still is a great spiritual being, one of those who possess the enormous power of the spiritual world, the world of God, capable of transforming any matter. When performing a miracle for which people asked, he would say, "According to your faith be it unto you." Some prayed to him for health, for healing a disease, and received it, others for food, some prayed for a haul of fish and others for the resurrection of the physical body. And the robber who hung next to Jesus on the cross, suffering from hunger and torture, while in death throes of his body, asked Christ only for the salvation of his soul. And this man was granted spiritual liberation by the one who is truly close to God in his eternal world. It is just that priests, presented this truth differently in the canonical Gospels by introducing the concept of resurrection in the body for the flock and omitting details about reincarnations and liberation of the soul, about which Jesus told people in his teaching. That is why priests destroyed the true followers of Christ, those who, despite priestly religions, remembered and kept his teaching in spiritual purity. For instance, suffice it to mention ruthless persecution and extermination by fire and sword of the Gnostics, in the 1st to 3rd centuries AD, and the Cathars, in the 11th to 13th centuries AD, who preserved the knowledge about reincarnations of the soul, about the dual nature of man, his essences, the role of the feminine principle in the creation of the world, about the power of signs and symbols and much more, which priests had tried to erase from the people's memory. Anastasia: yes, truly, according to your faith be it unto you. Rigdon: now, too, people go to church, but what do they ask of God, what do they pray for? For that same health, prosperity, wealth, success, and material benefits for themselves and their near and dear. This is the same sacrifice and service to the single animal mind, an invocation to the power of secret otherworldly and supernatural forces to achieve material goals and please one's mortal body. After all, nowadays almost every religion has prayers addressed to saints, gods, and spirits, which supposedly help in the treatment of one or another illness, in doing human deeds in the material world, and bring success in various everyday matters. And what is required of people for this? Just to pray, that is, to use their own inner deepest feelings of faith, about their problems in this world, about the material need, and to donate money to a certain temple, or rather, to those who own this temple. Priests have even created entire lists with detailed instructions of what believers must do and how, to whom, and in what human need to pray. And it is only at the end of this list that you can find a small postscript saying that, of course, you can also pray for a surge of spiritual energy and for the salvation of the soul. What will the person who is looking at this long list of desires of his back and lateral essences pay attention to? Anastasia: yes, it's no wonder that at the court of Osiris in the ancient Egyptian papyrus, where all these essences are placed one after another in a certain sequence, the front essence, the falcon-headed figure, stands last in this queue of human desires and prayers during the spent life. Rigdon: unfortunately, after all this time nothing has changed in this matter regarding either an individual or, as a consequence, society as a whole. Modern man must understand that no matter what religion he belongs to or even if he considers himself outside of religion, walking the spiritual path on his own, he must pray only for his soul's salvation and really work on himself in every day. It is necessary to put your animal nature on the altar of your life, giving up the multitude of its desires and illusory thoughts. For this is the only sacrifice that is acceptable to God, no matter by what epithets people call him, which opens a spiritual path into his world to a person. Anastasia: judging by letters from the readers who belong to the ranks of the faithful of different religions, people are also concerned about another issue regarding the salvation of the soul. Many people pray fervently not only for their own health or healing of their relatives but also for the salvation of the souls of all the people, considering the very thought of saving only their own soul to be selfish. Is this right or not? By the way, readers also note that they meet many people who talk with fervor about saving the world and mankind but who at the same time don't bother with transforming themselves spiritually. Rigdon: man always becomes like the person who serves as a role model for him. He is inclined to indulge in pride that he can also pray for someone, even though he himself is a spiritually immature being. And there are many such people. I would compare them to fishermen who found themselves in the middle of the river in the winter because of a misunderstanding and fell through the ice. The drowning fishermen are the state of the modern mankind. At the same time, many people, while sinking to the bottom and not even making an attempt to save themselves, foolishly waste time and energy thinking about how they will be saving others. But how can someone who is drowning himself save others? After all, in order to save someone, you must, first of all, get out onto solid ice and even better to the shore, and then save the rest. The gist of the truth is simple: save yourself first before saving others. Even if all the people on earth pray for the salvation of the soul of one person and the person himself does not want to change, then all these prayers and expenditures of spiritual powers will be for nothing. Nobody can obtain forgiveness for the accumulated sins of the personality and subpersonalities. Only the person himself, by changing internally and beginning to work on himself, can by real actions achieve fusion of his personality with the soul, become a spiritual being, and find true salvation in eternity. Of course, people can get health as well as wealth and success for someone by prayer, but in doing so they will reduce their chance of saving themselves and their soul, in fact, unwisely exchanging eternity for ashes. After all, what you have given your preference to is what you have received. You either sacrifice the spiritual, eternal, or the animal, transient. Such is the choice in the fleeting life of the personality. If a person, abiding in prayer, wishes for God to give him earthly blessings, from the health of the body to material wealth, then by doing this he, in fact, ruins his personality and his soul. Even while praying with good intentions for the health of his loved ones, is he doing good for their soul, all the more so for his own soul? You must not ask for anything material from God because, in fact, you will put your spiritual power into requests to the material world. And it is those that will be giving who run things in this world, whispering desires from the animal nature to you. It will all be given to you, that little for which you ask, but much more will be taken away from you. And God has nothing to do with it. After all, you yourself make a choice in favor of matter and, with your choice, you ruin your spiritual destiny, exchanging eternity for a mortal moment. Anastasia, the vast majority of people pray specifically for health simply out of ignorance, citing the fact that their ancestors did so, but more so because of fear of the unknown and of losing life. I myself in my young years experienced this panic from the animal nature and understand very well how these people feel. But in fact, if one looks in an unbiased way at the events of those years, I can say that the health problems at that time helped me radically change my attitude towards life. This encouraged me to seek alternative solutions, which ultimately led to you and to discovery of the spiritual world, thanks to your knowledge. This meeting influenced the rest of my fate, changed my life and, judging by the many letters from readers, not only mine. But I've met you in my life, and what are other people to do? Rigdon, actually, all the circumstances in the person's life, both bad and good ones, are given according to his or her strength. They are given for a person to understand something, to overcome himself, and encounter spiritual knowledge in one way or another. And with which dominance in his consciousness, he will be perceiving these circumstances is his personal choice, which ultimately determines the future, after death, fate of his personality. Different situations happen in life. Sometimes, a person is still full of life energy, and suddenly a deadly disease strikes him. As a rule, upon discovering it, the person starts, on the one hand, to reevaluate his life and, on the other, to give way to despair, yielding to provocative thoughts from the animal nature. After all, the animal nature always shows one and the same illusion to a person that he will live a very, very long time. People are often unaware of the transience of time and the necessity and the importance of spiritual work on themselves. But the truth of life is that man is not only mortal, he is suddenly mortal. In reality, he has no time for later, he only has here and now in this changeable material world. If the outcome is clear and there are no chances, even in such cases one should not despair. It is necessary to hold on and keep fighting for life. But most importantly, to double your effort of taking care of your soul and help other people to understand the real values of life and the transience of the given lifetime. If you have been able to realize it yourself, help someone else. After all, by helping other people, in the spiritual sense, you help yourself. Thus, you can help yourself much more than the doctor who is temporarily saving your material body. And death is death, one way or another, sooner or later, it will be inevitable for any person. What matters is not the number of years lived but the quality of the life lived in the spiritual sense. One person can live 120 years of useless selfish life, and another only 120 years, but of quality spiritual life, the life of a real human being. And the difference in their after-death fate will be enormous. After all, life does not end with death of the body. For the person who has practically no lifetime left, it is important to earn if not salvation of his personality and the soul, then at least peace. Anastasia, peace. Rigdon, yes. If at the end of his life, the truth suddenly opened to a person, but, in fact, he had been following it unconsciously all his life, then he has a chance, with the benefit of knowledge, even in the remaining part of his lifetime to make a breakthrough in his spiritual development and earn if not salvation of the soul, then at least peace. The latter means that if peace is destined for a person for his spiritual labor, then his current personality, when it becomes a subpersonality, will be blocked from its sufferings, although it will not be deprived of voiceless contemplation of the new personality's life's journey, its hardships and mistakes. After all, upon rebirth, figuratively speaking, together with the machine, the body, the driver changes as well. If he drives unskillfully through life, he brings extreme discomfort to all its silent passengers, subpersonalities. By the way, it is on the basis of echoes of the knowledge about peace that people created different after-death rituals, such as, for example, the burial service and so on. But the fact is that person himself must earn this peace during his lifetime. Of course, there are other cases when the person discovers the truth in the summer of his life, but rejects it, tempted by the illusion of the material world. However, time flies fast. At the end of life's journey, as a rule, such people become disappointed, for both the lies of illusions about the world and substitution from the animal nature manifest themselves. The person would gladly plunge into the truth, but his war is lost, and peace is no longer available. So people simply need to gain an understanding of the following: the material is for the material and the spiritual is for the spiritual. If a person has material problems, including health problems, he must solve them with help of the usual resources instead of focusing all his attention on this and drawing on his unique inner powers intended for spiritual salvation. Health issues relate exactly to the discipline of the mind and to abstaining from excessive desires of one's animal nature. All illnesses are cured with knowledge. If a person already has a serious health problem, well, there are doctors and specialists in various diseases. Modern medicine, as a science, today has so expanded its capabilities in the field of genetics, pharmacology, and biotechnology that actually many diseases can be cured now, even those which are today said to be incurable. Furthermore, modern medicine even allows to fight such a disease as old age. Anastasia, prolongation of biological life beyond the limit of the species, that is, increasing life for an extended period of time. Yeah, I still remember the results of your unique experiments. Rigdon, well, I am not talking about that now, but about capabilities of modern medicine. Anastasia, I must say that I have been very impressed with your research in these areas, especially with the experiments on prolongation of the lifespan of laboratory animals. What surprised me most is that in order to make this medicinal drug, you used simple ingredients that are available for mass production. Chronoprotector, as our mutual acquaintance called it jokingly. As they say, every joke has a bit of a joke in it. Your experimental drug is a true protection against time. After all, the results of your experiment, in fact, prove that it is possible already today to prolong the human life up to 200 years at least, and at best in the future, taking into account functionality of the human brain, up to 1,000 years. Rigdon, it is possible, without, by the way, biological aging. But what is the point? Where a direct way is apparent, what is the point of taking a detour? Anastasia, well. As far as I remember, at the beginning of the experiment, the animals had the biological age that was above the average, which, when counted in human years, would equal to 65 years. Already after a few months, as a result of the overall regeneration of the body, which followed after only 3 injections of the medicine, the biological age of the laboratory animals corresponded to 35–40 years of human life. And most importantly, it remained so until the animals were withdrawn from the experiment. Rigdon, yes, the animals were withdrawn from the experiment when their real age exceeded the limit of the species by more than 2 times. So what? Anastasia, that is more than 200 years when converted to human age. And had the animals continued to receive these, so to speak, chronoprotectors, they could have lived much longer. Rigdon, absolutely. If you are leading up to a conclusion about humans, then I shall tell you the following. Even if a person who has lived to see old age, not to mention adolescence, starts receiving this medicine, then his body will rejuvenate itself to middle age and it will stay in such a state for a long time. As the experiment has shown, over 200 years and without aging at that, preserving middle age of the body throughout life. Naturally, immortality of the material body is out of the question, for any matter is mortal. But it is quite possible to significantly prolong the biological life of the human being beyond the limit of the species and, what is more, to do it scientifically. There is no magic here, it is just ordinary knowledge. After all, the intercellular matrix was at the basis of the medicine I used. Anastasia, it's an amazing fact that you've practically proved that the intercellular matrix as a unique intercellular substance plays a crucial role in the regeneration of body cells and affects life prolongation beyond the limit of the species. As of today, science knows that the molecular damage of the structures of the intercellular matrix not only accompanies aging but also causes many serious diseases. Rigdon, naturally, even small changes in the structure of the intercellular matrix contribute to development of various kinds of pathologies. One of the major causes of aging is exactly the increase of molecular changes in the body, primarily in the structure of the intercellular matrix. Anastasia, the intercellular matrix in the human body is quite diverse and in general has been studied well enough. But no research has paid much attention to that kind of preform of the intercellular matrix as such which you pointed out and which is hidden in the embryonic cord. Rigdon, there is an ancient wisdom, the cause of every end is hidden in the beginning. Anastasia, that's a fact. What is currently taking place in the scientific world causes confusion, to say the least. After all, the scientists who study the problems of gerontology got stuck at the point that the lifespan of each species, including the human being, is genetically predetermined, and as of today, it has been scientifically proven that the human potential has the capacity of 100 to 120 years. So scientists focus their research on the prolongation of the active period of life of the elderly person without leaving the limits of this research. They are running in circles round the stem cells of the body to get caught in the endless loop of developing and selling peptide drugs. But it doesn't go further than this. Rigdon, well, I think the answer is obvious why it does not go any further in today's society, with its powerful modern technology and global scientific potential. Anastasia, right, I understand that in the modern world, the consumer attitude to life, unfortunately, is becoming increasingly more dominant in the minds of people, and the very format of the social worldview leaves much to be desired. But your knowledge and developments are a landmark sensation. They contain unique information about the intercellular matrix, the necessary conditions for body regeneration, and about peculiarities of creating artificial gravity. This is valuable information about the human being even for such sciences as gravitational physiology and biology. After all, this field of knowledge is practically a blank spot in science. The influence of the gravitational field in which we live hasn't been studied enough. What about space? We haven't even gone into space beyond the Earth's gravitational field, not to mention the study of gravity and its effect on the human being on other planets. So when will people experimentally get to the numerical characteristics of the impact of different levels of gravity and to the understanding that in the human body there is a whole system that reacts to changes in gravity, not to mention a way to control it? How many centuries will it take? Rigdon, what will change in man himself? Different time, different burden. Besides, will people have this time? Anastasia, well, as they say, better late than never. After all, already today scientists understand that functioning of a living organism depends, to a large extent, on the magnitude of gravitational forces and how fast the body responds to the reduction of gravity, decreasing the volume of that same proverbial intercellular fluid. But that's not the point here. After all, your knowledge and research actually prove that planet Earth with its gravity conditions is not the native home of mankind. You can say that we're all aliens here. Your information provides the basis for theoretical calculations of gravitational conditions under which self-regeneration takes place in the human body and, consequently, lifespan increases by dozens of times what it currently is. This will be such a breakthrough in the human worldview. Rigdon, because the consumer mindset dominates in today's society, it is better that people think that they have descended from a monkey on Earth. The knowledge you are referring to is useful only when the entire world community, or at least its majority, will go in the direction of spiritual development and domination of the spiritual nature in people. Otherwise, this knowledge is meaningless. When the animal nature dominates the consciousness of the majority, the life of people will be bitter like a melted candle, which gives neither light nor warmth. For the present society, this knowledge will do no good. Furthermore, I would say it would be harmful for the reason that an increase in the human lifespan, even by 20 years, will result in an increase in population of the planet. This will inevitably lead to crises, both food and economic ones, which would be partially created artificially by politicians and priests. Especially, since in this matter, it is also necessary to consider the growing negative dynamics of the activity of different natural processes on Earth. In order to avoid all these consequences at such a time and prolong the lives of people, it is, first of all, necessary to change the vector of development of society from the consumer one to the spiritual and creating vector, so that the universal spiritual and moral laws would be dominant in society, and not on paper but in deed. Knowledge is, first of all, a responsibility. If these developments fall into the hands of a limited circle of people, then this will lead to even more serious consequences for the entire mankind than if the majority of people possessed them. Just imagine some priests or politicians getting hold of these developments. They have always been the first ones interested in these breakthroughs in science in order to immortalize themselves and the power of their animal nature. Suffice it to look into history, representatives of secret societies have sought the elixir of immortality for centuries. However, immortality in the body is definitely a myth, for any matter is mortal and finite. But extending life for a certain period of time is quite real. With that in mind, just imagine what would happen if people, their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren would tolerate and feed for 200 years some group of priests and politicians who will not grow old while generations of people will be dying. This will inevitably lead to wars and bloodshed. Once again, the animal mind will dominate through human weaknesses, and one matter will be destroying the other. What is the point? The time of life is transient and flies very quickly, no matter whether it is 100, 200, or 1,000 years. But will man's torment and his inner anguish subside as a result of it? And then you will have to answer for all these spent years, for everything that you have created in yourself during these moments. Those who have truly come into contact with the spiritual world of God through the depth of their feelings understand how transient and short-lived all this illusory material world is. Personally, I would not for a minute extend the predetermined period of existence for myself in this material world, in this mortal body with its perennial problems and desires. Anastasia: yes, that's true. However, this is understood by those who have personal spiritual experience. Most people, however, can't even control themselves and their animal nature. I think that when people's lives are longer, they will have more opportunities to understand themselves. They won't be in such a hurry as now, galloping through life, making many mistakes, living according to templates just like everybody else and realizing only towards the end of their lives that all this was empty and not worthy of their attention. They will have time to learn and understand the knowledge and consciously develop themselves spiritually, given the experience of their mistakes in the past. After all, it can also be seen as a chance for their spiritual development, for achieving fusion of the personality with the soul and going beyond the material world. Rigdon: yes, for a person it can indeed be a chance, but only when society changes its behavior patterns, its consumer outlook. Which is nothing complicated. It is necessary for the human being to understand his true, spiritual essence. Then he will be able to bring real changes into the life of society and awaken people around him. In this respect, even one person is a warrior and can do many useful things. After all, in life, each person has many roles, which provide him with an opportunity to communicate with different people: a parent, relative, neighbor, friend, professional, athlete, student, worker, leader, social activist, resident of the internet, and so on. And to think of how many people he has already encountered in his life: childhood friends, classmates, fellow students, colleagues, business partners, distant relatives, and acquaintances. This is already a whole mini society, people whom he met in the past and those with whom he communicates in the present. So it means he can make changes everywhere, both at work and at home, both among the people he knows and among those he does not know, regardless of their nationality, social status, and religion. All of these seemingly different personalities really have much in common. We are all human beings, we all suffer from the same manifestations of the animal nature and rejoice alike at the real spiritual manifestations, for we are all guests in the material world, and here temporarily. Anastasia: yes, you are right, there's nothing difficult about it, you just constantly perfect yourself spiritually, live by the spiritual world, apply this knowledge to practice, and you begin to live in society humanely, as befits a real human being, and then pass this knowledge on. When we look around and see what's going on in religions and in the world politics, it seems that there are many different faiths now, and practically all of them urge one to take care of one's spiritual purity and moral values. But in reality, and it is no secret now, most ministers of all kinds of cults are guided purely by mercenary interests, and they form consumer way of thinking in people, tightening the loop of matter around a person even more and knocking spiritual foundation out from under his feet. Wherever you look, substitutions are everywhere. Priests exploit crowds of believers like farmers exploit dairy cows, cajoling material resources from their pockets under any pretext. They stop at nothing and use power over the flock to increase their political influence for personal gain, of course. Not to mention politics. The result of the effect of the animal mind on society through this area of activity, associated with power and control, is evident. Selfishness, acquisitiveness, and the dog-eat-dog attitude has become a norm in society. Nations are divided into social groups, parties, and religions, and they are forced to oppose, fight, and kill one another for interests of their leaders, who use one and the same ancient method of different promises to control the masses. It is clear how and for what purpose aggression is activated in the world community, but the sad thing is that people themselves support this. And this happens at a time when just the opposite is needed. the entire international community must consolidate for the sake of survival of mankind as a species, given the growth of dynamics, frequency, and scale of natural disasters as well as those problems humanity will face in the near future. Rigdon: yes, unless society changes, mankind simply will not survive. During the time of global change, people, because of an aggressive activation of the animal nature, which obeys the general animal mind, like any other intelligent matter, will simply fight for survival on their own. That is, nations will be destroying one another, and those who survive will be destroyed by nature itself. It is only possible to survive the coming cataclysms if the whole humanity unites and the society transforms in the spiritual sense. If people are jointly able to change the direction of movement of the international community from the consumer channel towards the true spiritual development, with the domination of the spiritual nature in it, then the mankind will have a chance to survive this period. What is more, both the society and future generations will be able to reach an entirely new stage of its development. But nowadays this depends on the real choices and actions of each person. Most importantly, many intelligent people of the planet understand this. They see the impending disaster and the collapse of society, but they do not know how to withstand all this and what to do. Anastasia, what needs to be done in order to change the society here and now? Where do we start? Rigdon: start with the simple, start with yourself. When a person understands the meaning of his life and the meaning of spiritual development, he will qualitatively change himself. And if this knowledge is available to many people on earth, then the society as a whole will change sooner or later and, therefore, the vector of movement of the human civilization as a whole will be entirely different. Anastasia: it is actually very difficult for a modern person, who has gotten tangled up in the works of the human mind, in the host of existing religions, their concepts and dogmas, to understand the spiritual essence, that meaning, and the true reason for which he exists in this world. The simple truth became complicated, and because of this, the essence became incomprehensible. Of course, a variety of tools is available to almost any person today. There are spiritual practices, prayers, meditation techniques, and so on. The ultimate goal is clear: it is spiritual liberation. But this common foundation, the essence, thanks to which this higher spiritual state is achieved, has been lost. After all, tools themselves don't give an understanding of the fundamental principle. It lies in the consciousness and the deepest feelings of the master who works on himself with the help of these tools. Could you tell people about the elementary truth? What is the purpose of human spiritual development? Rigdon: the purpose of human spiritual development is in his qualitative interchange. This implies, first of all, not just recovery of the inner spiritual dialogue with God in each day lived through your deepest feelings, through your sincere love for Him, but also living by this mystery. Human, in reality, is drawn to such pure inner dialogue with God. This innermost need is most manifested in him in childhood when the memory of incarnations is still fresh. He feels this deep sensual contact through his soul, which can manifest outwardly in the form of sincere child's joy and the all-embracing, pure love for everything and everyone. That is why it is believed that children are closer to God than adults. After all, the new personality is still pure and is connected to the soul by its sincerity and faith, and the latter harbors hope of salvation towards the new personality. That is why, from that point on, it seems to a person for the most part of his life that the best is yet to come. In fact, in the minutes of manifestation of his sincere happiness, the little person is experiencing the deepest feelings of coming in contact with his spiritual nature, attention, love, and care of God for his soul, even in such difficult for it conditions as confinement in the body. Over time, the new personality starts to perceive and know the surrounding world, and this conversation through feelings is transferred to the communication with the closest people, mother, father, and relatives. The first external visual images are fixed in consciousness, thanks to experiencing at this time the deepest feelings of sincere love coming from God. The latter is connected solely with the inner world of a human, with this wordless, true conversation with God in his love. That is why we have the warmest memories of childhood, for example, of the mother as of the Almighty, the loved being, for whom nothing is impossible in this world. But as adults, we look at her already through different eyes, as an adult woman with her own fate. When the body begins to mature and the new personality begins to make the choice in favor of the animal nature more often, person, through folly, loses this invisible sensual dialogue with God. Although the soul itself does not stop knocking at the person, giving him its signals. In the person's life, circumstances arise, which, in one way or another, urge him to return to the soul-soothing dialogue with God. But the person, guided by thoughts from the animal nature, refuses to listen and to be heard by his spiritual nature, which is the soul conducting God's love. At that point, the animal nature substitutes itself for this live communication. The personality, observing its thoughts, can clearly trace this process in itself if it wishes. This process begins when the person, when distracted by thoughts from the animal nature, or, as they said in the ancient times, by the ashes, loses the dialogue with the one who is eternal, the one who is most dear and near to him. At this moment, the person starts feeling inner loneliness. As a consequence of this, he starts making a substitution, looking for external communication with those who, like he himself, are temporal here and consist of dust. Or, completely succumbing to the thoughts of his animal nature, he begins to talk to himself. But this communication is completely different from the spiritual dialogue with God. Feelings of sincerity and spiritual purity leave him, while feelings of resentment, pride, jealousy, and self-interest appear. These are the most radical substitutions from the animal nature when it dominates consciousness. They take place because one ceases to understand himself and his spiritual nature, which makes up the true meaning of his life. His earthly selfhood distorts the understanding of the power of the deepest desire of the soul to become free and independent of matter, to escape from its captivity. A person no longer understands his real feelings. He locks himself away from everyone in his selfish fortress. He begins to try on the image masks offered by the animal nature. In such a state, he mentally addresses not God but himself. He actually begins to listen to and talk only to himself, or rather, to his animal nature, which substitutes the eternal truth with a temporal illusion, turning the person into its conductor. Such a dialogue with himself turns into a dialogue of a mortal human, which makes him spiteful and dependent on many material needs. He no longer lives by God, he is no longer free, he finds pleasure and the meaning of his miserable existence in matter, devoting his lifetime and attention to accumulating it, in bringing others under his control and inflicting suffering upon them. At that, the essence of this substitution is that the person himself does not notice this. It seems to him that he is doing everything right, and this way, in his opinion, will be better for others. But abiding in the dialogue of a mortal person, he finds no happiness and continues to sway in his material desires like a pendulum. Time passes, and an understanding comes that all this is vanity of vanities. He recalls that at one time in his childhood he had sincere joy, pure love, and confidence, which gave him a sensation of incredible inner freedom. And now there is no sincerity, no purity, and no faith, everything is lost, and each day brings only sorrow to his soul. But God's love does not leave man even when he forgets about it. God never leaves a human, for his love, thanks to the soul, is always with him. However, a human does not always want to accept. But God's love does not leave man even when he forgets about it. God never leaves a human, for his love, thanks to the soul, is always with him. However, a human does not always want to accept this eternal love and often puts off the sacred learning of it until later, guided by momentary, temporary desires of mortal matter. But man does not have this later, there is only here and now, in which true movement and choice take place. One only needs to open up and trust in God. There is no point in wasting the precious time of life. As soon as the animal nature begins an attack that stimulates the feeling of loneliness, one simply must immediately overcome this earthly selfhood and, with the sincerity of a child, address God, relying on His will. Address as you can, with your sincere words, thoughts, and, most importantly, with the inner, deepest feeling like for the nearest and dearest being. When the person begins to talk to his soul with a feeling of deep repentance, the love of God multiplies in him manifold. God comes into the soul and gives it peace. It becomes a source of inexhaustible inner power for the person. It revives in him the spirit of faith, provides an opportunity to understand the experience gained and get a new perspective on his life. The person acquires the gift of insight, he abides in love, for he abides in God and God in him. He has something to say to God and he has the power of sincerity and faith needed to feel his spiritual answer. And this dialogue of the two beings who love each other is infinite. For God is communication in love. Man realizes that abiding in this communion, spiritualization, and unity with God is the real, true life. This mystery happens in each of us when we accept it and open up before God in our sincere feelings. But if the person relies on his selfhood, he himself closes the gate of his soul and feels forever lonely, regardless of how many friends or relatives surround him. But if the gate of the soul is open for communion with God, a person is never alone, for he is always in conversation with him. When he resumes this inner communication with God, a sound understanding comes to him that his perception of life is limited and that he sees only a part of it. God is the only one who sees the life of a human in its fullness. An understanding comes that even the greatest suffering is that circumstance which actually takes him to the path of communication with God and a renewal of the lost spiritual connections. For God sees man's temptations and his potential for inner spiritual changes. That is why God gives such circumstances, thanks to which the person gains experience and an understanding of his choice, an opportunity to restore communication with him, which ultimately contributes to the fusion of the personality with the soul and escape into the spiritual world. But the choice is always up to a human what to live with, mortal pride or eternal grace. Spiritual practices help a person perfect this dialogue with God at the deep level of feelings, where purity of intentions reigns. They act as guides that create conditions for the personality to connect with the soul, enrich the inner world, and acquire knowledge, power, and the purity of feelings emanating from the spiritual world. Spiritual practices are the tools with which the person starts to understand an entirely different world and to realize his very close relationship to it. They accompany the personality from the first tentative step of cognition to the complete transition to the spiritual world, from the desire to change oneself to understanding the necessity of abiding in God constantly. This is a way of life. This is the way to eternity. This is like a breath of fresh air, water, light, and spiritual warmth. This is the joy of repentance and the happiness of abiding in God's love. The person who begins to work on himself and to learn spiritual practices often gives up doing them, becomes discouraged, reluctant and lazy to do them, inventing excuses for oneself and different distractions from the dialogue with God. But when such a state appears, you should stop and think, who is it that does not let you talk to God? Who creates mental barriers and illusory obstacles in your consciousness? Who makes you think that the matters of this temporal, instantaneous world are more significant than the most important thing in your life, spiritual salvation in eternity? Who does not want you to walk the spiritual path? There is one answer: the animal nature. This is why when its clear opposition is manifested in the form of laziness, unwillingness, and excuses, you should double your efforts and begin to work on yourself spiritually. On the contrary, it is necessary to increase the time of meditations, dive deeper into feelings no matter what, knock at the spiritual world more persistently and restore your salvational sincere dialogue with God. You must do spiritual practices at least twice a day and during the day preserve the connection with your inner world, with the soul, with the sense of God's presence. Then it will be not just a way of life, it will become that spiritual path which with every step will be bringing you into eternity. When the person lives in God, he has no inner discord, no conflict with himself. He no longer has the desire for individual requests, which are full of fear and worries of the material world, because he understands that the essence of their origin is from his earthly selfhood. He no longer tries to understand with the mind where God is at work and where not, for he starts to feel and know all this. And this knowledge comes not from the mind but from the deepest feelings of the soul. After all, man believes with the mind but knows with the soul. He begins to focus his inner life only on the soul, for through it, he cognizes God and the infinite spiritual world, which is his real home. Man acquires oneness with his own soul. There is no more space left in him for bad things because he begins to live in God's world, a sense of peace from contact with him. And such communication takes place constantly. There is no longer anything other than God in man's inner life, and the soul stands pure before him. This communion is a mystery of the two. Man feels the presence of God and loves him, reaches out for him like a loving person for the loved being to whom he craves to be forever near and to communicate with him infinitely. Over time, the person gets a real understanding of the fact that not only is God constantly present in him but that he is present everywhere, in the entire surrounding world. Man realizes that God is everything to everyone. So, the one who has started the dialogue with God soon changes himself, acquiring a different understanding and a different view of the world. But most importantly, the personality during its life, thanks to such independent communication with God, begins to abide in his spiritual world, acquiring that state of fusion with the soul, which in various religions is called differently, holiness, nirvana, the supreme connection with God, and so on. This state is that true freedom, that true existence, to which man aspires his entire life. Anastasia, thank you from all the people who truly thirst for spiritual enlightenment. This understanding truly opens one's eyes to the real essence of the spiritual development of each person. Rigdon, do not thank me, thank him, for the one conducting only humbly passes on his will, his wisdom. Anastasia, thank you. Yes, words cannot express everything, there are so many sincere feelings here. For the many people who thirst for the truth, this is a real spiritual insight, a revelation how to qualitatively transform oneself. Rigdon, it is important for people to remember that attention is the key element in their everyday life. Whatever a person pays and gives attention to in his life, to what thoughts, preferences, and desires, is what he receives. In its real manifestation, life is informational exchange, which is far from being limited to the narrow spectrum of the perceptible and audible frequencies, which man perceives to a degree in this three-dimensional world. I have already used the figurative example of information building blocks, bricks, to explain that information is everywhere and is contained in everything. It exists outside of time and space because it forms everything, including time and space. Information influences an individual constantly, but it starts fully working within such an individual, according to its program, only when the individual begins to give it attention, that is, when he makes a choice. That is, activation takes place of the human structures which are connected not only to the three-dimensional world, for instance, consciousness, subconsciousness, but also to the overall human energy structure. The personality, unnoticed by itself, starts to live by this information, it becomes a part of its reality. Therefore, by paying attention to certain information, one creates one's subsequent destiny with his choice. By giving the power of his attention to such information, he, in fact, gives life to the program contained therein, which is what transforms his life into one or another reality. Anastasia, yes, this is a very important point for understanding how a person becomes a conductor of the will of the animal mind or a conductor of the will of the spiritual world. It's all about constant choice. Whichever information, a program of someone's will, one put the most attention into and supports, that is exactly the will he becomes a conductor of. The problem of modern mankind is that many people do not understand themselves, thus they thoughtlessly give their attention to the external but not to the inner world. Rigdon, human's main component, around which his entire structure is built, is the soul, and the personality in this structure represents a module for the spiritual, qualitatively new transformation of this power. By the way, the word module, when translated from Latin, modulus, means a small unit or a small measure. In other words, the fundamental principle in the human being is his spiritual component. The intention of creation of man as of a rational entity with the spiritual fundamental element lies in his spiritual transformation of himself with the preservation of the right of choice, in the creation of a true conductor of the powers of the spiritual world under conditions of the material world. Indeed, many people in the modern world do not understand themselves, their real capabilities, and the tremendous spiritual power contained within them, and that is why they do not understand how to transform their lives and the life of society in order to improve their quality. They do not even understand what real life or real happiness is. People attempt to substitute even the internal spiritual feast of communication with God and contact with the spiritual world, which the person experiences by the deepest feelings during spiritual practices, for external rites and celebrations invented by the human mind. Yet, the most interesting thing is that man also awaits this external humane celebration with great hope. And, when it happens, then it, in fact, drains the person, turning him into a kind of an orphan, by disappointing sensations, for the person has been subconsciously waiting for something greater, not in terms of entertainment or satisfying the flesh but in the deepest feelings, which he didn't get. All this is due to the fact that this is a substitution of the real spiritual rejoicing, which the person experiences every time coming in contact with the spiritual world, for an ordinary theatrical performance from the mind with associated external material decorations. So many concepts in people's lives are substituted by setting the programs of the will of the animal mind, for people themselves often choose thoughts and desires from the animal mind, focusing their attention and life energy on them. People's problem lies in the fact that, while making their choice and becoming conductors and executors of the will of the animal mind, without even understanding this, they believe that it, the animal mind, does not exist as such. After all, the animal mind is invisible to their eyes, unlike their physical bodies and the surrounding three-dimensional world. Such people underestimate its might and power. They do not understand its capabilities of controlling the human mind, and, most importantly, its aspiration for the total materialization of people's consciousness in the entire human community. And the latter will turn all people, without exception, into conductors of the will of the animal mind, which will increase its power considerably. The resource of the life energy of mankind with its capabilities related to the presence of the perpetual engine. The soul, in the structure of each person is very important to the animal mind. For the smart ones, it is enough to take a look at the events of the last centuries. How dramatically the population of the planet has increased, how much in just a span of just 2 centuries technologies have developed, that are primarily designed to ensure mass communication of people on the planet, that is, to promote unification of everyone into a single information field. How at the same time the consumer format of thinking is being intensively imposed all over the world, how an evident slant of the civilization towards matter is taking place. This is none other than preparation by the animal mind for total control over mankind and use of its powers and resources for its own purposes, which may not even be related to the three-dimensional world. Within its power, there are dimensions that are higher and more interesting within the limits of the densely populated material world, where even minor changes entail more global changes in the lower dimensions, which lead to certain results of the replenishment of animal mind's power. And the latter is necessary for the survival of the animal mind itself, which depends on matter, and for extension of its temporary existence in opposition to the greater powers, the powers of AllatRA. And for this, the animal mind will not spare any sacrifices in the form of collective and individual minds subordinated to its will. So, people should think hard on which edge the global community is currently standing, whose will they are thoughtlessly implementing, and what consequences await both every personality individually and the human civilization as a whole. Today, it is extremely important for the mankind, just as it is for every personality, to wake up spiritually, unite on the spiritual basis, and change the minus to plus, using for spiritual purposes the technical base prepared by the animal mind to do this. And the result will not keep itself waiting. In the invisible world, such decisions and actions taken by the consolidated humanity can stop the vortex of the rapidly growing spinning of events along the reverse swastika. Thanks to which, people will not only be able to prevent future events that are to take place according to the program of the animal mind, which threaten the very fact of mankind's existence, but also to spin the vortex of events in the direction of the right swastika. The latter is nothing other than activating the creating powers of AllatRA and, consequently, creating a completely different future for the entire mankind. Anastasia, yes, I understand what you are talking about, for the real capabilities both of man and society as a whole are not limited to the three-dimensional world. However, in order for the society to attain a qualitatively different level of understanding, people must learn to control their animal nature. They need to live by the spiritual transformation. Rigdon, perfectly true. This is exactly why the main base of the primordial spiritual knowledge has been given, starting with your previous books and ending with this one. They are sufficient for the person not only to awake spiritually but also, by working on himself, to independently attain spiritual fusion of his personality with the soul. Certainly, provided that people really engage in self-perfection, do not distort this knowledge, and follow it as if along a navigating channel, while expanding their horizons of knowing the world and orientating themselves spiritually in this turbulent ocean of material life. The knowledge comes to a person at an important stage of his life, even if he is unaware of this, but it is revealed to him only when the person begins to spiritually transform himself and becomes worthy of accepting it. Otherwise, it will be of no use to him. The important thing is how well people will master the already obtained knowledge, how significant the changes in their inner spiritual growth will be, and what transformations will take place in the society as a result. Because the next level of knowledge is an opportunity for people to make spiritual transformations in the higher dimensions of the material world which, as I have already mentioned, can lead to global changes in the lower dimensions. And this is great responsibility. This means a clash with forces of the animal mind, which will not give up its ground that easily. This, if you will, is the area of using supernatural powers, or, as this used to be called, the art of the supreme white magic, and people who directly opposed the animal mind's forces, against which they waged battles on that side of reality, were named Jalayars. Anastasia, well, unfortunately, today most people do not understand elementary spiritual things. And those who even receive this knowledge are often in no hurry to transform themselves, living by their old templates imposed by the system of the animal mind. People still lack a firm desire to live and create from their spiritual nature. This is also seen from ordinary situations in life. For instance, a person, upon reading these books and coming into contact with the truth, is quickly inspired with the desire to work on himself and make spiritual changes in his life. However, after a short period of time, having once again shifted his attention to everyday problems and troubles of the material world, his spiritual desire quickly fades away. Through the animal nature, the system once again takes control of his consciousness, although the person's soul greatly suffers from such animal oppression. Rigdon, the person who lives by the hidden desires of his animal nature is spiritually weak. That is why, upon coming in contact with the truth, he gets inflamed like a match, but then he is quickly extinguished because he still has no spiritual support either in himself or in the society around him. But if the person has a firm intention of escaping the reign of power of his animal nature, then he must return more often to the source of the truth, the books which will help him to shift his attention and come out of the narrowed state of consciousness. Moreover, one must understand that at initial stages of his spiritual development, communication with like-minded people will play a major role for him. This spiritual mutual support is particularly important for those who are at the very beginning of their journey. Just recall how such communication within your group helped you all at the beginning of your spiritual journey to overcome not only the lack of confidence in yourself and in your strength but also to resist hidden attacks of the animal nature in time. The thing is that at the initial stages of the person's awakening, simple confusion and templated substitutions often take place in his head, which results in misreading where manifestations of his animal nature are and where the spiritual nature is manifesting itself. In a group of like-minded people, communicating with other people, one comes to understand oneself faster and better. As a rule, at first people are afraid of giving away the secrets of their animal nature, especially in a group. They fear bearing their problems in public, though they gladly listen to those who have the courage to do this. When the person gives up the positions of his animal nature, then, in essence, he blocks its loopholes, that is, the possibility of secret action. Besides, a group of like-minded people will not only hear the person out but will also share their own similar situations and methods they have found for resolving them. Thus, one gets not only spiritual support from like-minded people but also helpful input which expands his knowledge and experience. Such practice has existed since ancient times. For example, the early Christians practiced the so-called public confessions in small communes. This is basically the same heart-to-heart chat with friends, which brings spiritual benefit to the person. But with creation of the institution for controlling the masses, religion, much was turned upside down. Anastasia, that is so. Officially, the practice of confession for all the faithful of sensible age was introduced into Christianity in 1215 by resolutions of the Fourth Council of the Lateran. By the way, that council adopted a whole set of measures to fight heresy, including creating the Inquisition, for the purpose of strengthening the authority of the Church. Those measures were included into reforms and the development of the Code of the Canon Law. This was the Church's response to the spread of the mass-scale heretical movements in the early 13th century, Cathars, Albigenses, Waldenses, and so on. The latter's guilt was only in the fact that people wanted to know the truth about the real teaching of Christ and started searching for it and developing spiritually without intermediaries. So then, regarding the accepted by religion practice of confession, it was imposed on the believer that he should do it at least once a year. The believer had to confess his sins to a priest who, in turn, gave absolution in the name of Jesus Christ using words of absolution that had been specifically determined by the Church. It was considered a necessary condition for the person to obtain divine forgiveness, for it had been established by the priests that without a confession, the person would not be allowed to Holy Communion, and without it, there would supposedly be no salvation for one, because due to the Church dogma, communion is a reunion with Christ, a blessed communion of the soul to eternal life. Otherwise, the person was expelled from religion. They scared him by telling him that he would be denied the right to be buried according to the Christian rites and so on. Yes, of course, the difference is significant. It is one thing when man himself aspires to improve and perfect himself, to communicate with like-minded people and friends, wants to understand himself, to receive spiritual support, and do what he can to help others. And it's quite another when the person is obliged to do it under threat of excommunication from the Church and public harassment. Moreover, on behalf of an official organization, the Roman Catholic Church, which in those days, in fact, was an institution of executive power. Indeed, everything was turned upside down as if on purpose so that people would repent out of fear and not be guided by spirit, so that they would not even think about engaging in spiritual pursuits on their own. Rigden, these are exactly substitutions from the animal mind, which people do not notice while being its conductors, thinking that such thoughts are their own. that they are intended to strengthen their power and at the same time to supposedly contribute to the population's spiritual growth. Spiritual matters cannot be forced, it is one's personal choice that is important here. Everything is built on it. After all, there are no bad people, there are just people who do not know their real spiritual abilities, and so they suffer. Anastasia, it is known that man's personal spiritual transformation has always had a certain impact on the society around him. You have repeatedly mentioned that if such spiritually awakened people were a majority, then the society, too, would change. Could you tell people how to qualitatively transform society in order to get away from the cliches and stereotypical templates of the animal nature as well as consumer thinking and reorient the vector of movement of modern civilization towards spiritual development? Rigdon, everything is simple. It is necessary to create conditions for a fundamentally new model of society, taking into consideration the dual nature of a human being, eliminating the smallest possibilities of manifestation of the animal nature's temptations in all spheres of the society. How to start building such a society? If the majority of people indeed have an intention to create a civilization that would live according to the spiritual principles, everything can be solved in a very simple way. The first thing to do is to put the spiritual development of society in order. In a civilization that is oriented towards the spiritual vector, that is, claims a high level of development, there should be no fragmentation into different religions. Furthermore, there should be no religion as such as an institution of controlling the masses and no intermediaries between God and man. It should not have even a hint of such a phenomenon as the priesthood, no matter what they call this structure, which creates religious systems and institutions of different religions in the world. There should be a desire and certain actions of society itself in creating life conditions for the spiritual development of the human personality as such, as a basic component of such a society. The dawn of mankind saw the beginnings of such an organization of people's lives, where more attention was paid to the spiritual life of community, while material problems were secondary. As a result of geographic and other causes, many groups of people, who had one and the same spiritual grains of knowledge, existed isolated from each other. Over time, because primordial knowledge got lost and the animal nature became more dominant in people, a division within groups began, and social inequality emerged. The emergence of the institution of priesthood and the establishment of different religions was based on the foundation of the initial spiritual grains of the knowledge. However, the system itself was built according to the material dominant. In fact, it is an attempt of the animal mind to completely dominate and control the conglomerate of intelligent matter it deems to be humanity with its unique source of power, life energy intended for spiritual purposes. Anastasia, that means that religion as a system serves the interests of the animal mind, although it attracts masses of people to itself precisely because of the spiritual grains. Yes, if we look at all the variety of spiritual teachings, beliefs, and religions of the world's nations while rejecting the husks of the priestly system and its concepts, presence of one and the same knowledge becomes obvious, how a person should adhere to the spiritual path and not fall for temptations of the material world. It's just that all these grains of knowledge are, in fact, about one and the same thing, but served in a variety of human interpretations. Rigdon, that is correct, and this knowledge is not a religion, that is why it can be found in different parts of the planet among different peoples with different beliefs. This knowledge contributes to the natural process of the spiritual development of man, regardless of race, nationality, a region of residence, social status, and so on. But by using this knowledge, priests created their own religions, which are the fruit of the human mind. They came up with distinctive features and differences of one religion from another only in order to have power over a large number of people. History of humanity has seen times when attempts were made to turn masses of people into atheists. It seemed they were pursuing noble goals, to save people from the iron heel of the priesthood. But the problem was that the animal nature still remained dominant in different spheres of society. So instead of a bright future, conditions were created in humanity for a worse form of the dominance of the animal mind's will to manifest in people's consciousness. The concepts of the soul and God were eliminated for new generations as such and replaced by the selfish I and material priorities in life. The result of such a treatment of mankind by the animal mind is evident. The materialistic worldview dominates in the world society, and the consciousness of most people has been enslaved by material behavior patterns and directives. Today, a person who believes in one God and prays for the salvation of his soul is, unfortunately, perceived by most people as a relic of the past, as a kind of an individual who has been alienated from society and whose consciousness is supposedly blinkered by a religion or a sect, even if he has nothing to do with these organizations. Why has such a negative attitude towards the main meaning of the human life, spiritual development, God, and the soul, gained such a foothold in today's society? Because the priorities of the animal mind are being promoted and glorified everywhere, and they orient society towards material values and consumer principles. The minds of people are dominated by an attitude of saving and accumulating money, property, real estate, an unlimited right to preserve and pass them on by inheritance. Man narrow-mindedly sees the purpose of his life in this, thus attempting to get fame for himself not only during life but also to keep it after his death. This is a sort of an element of a substitution from the animal mind, so to speak, a substitute for immortality. Individual desires of the masses of people are reduced to an aspiration to possess something, have power in the material world, turn everything that surrounds them, including themselves, into their indivisible property. All this does not simply point at pathogenic signs of infection of society by the animal mind's attitudes but also at the fact that humanity is coming to the edge of self-destruction. And unless urgent measures are taken now for its spiritual recovery, tomorrow may be too late, because destructive processes will have become irreversible. The most important thing is to realize that only man himself can save both himself and the surrounding society, with his choice and his actions. Anastasia, yes, those two age-old questions are, who is to blame, and what do we do? Rigdon, people must not waste time searching for someone to blame, entertaining their animal nature, or wait for someone to do something for them. They themselves need to start acting and become a good example to others. In society, people are drawn to those who have honor and dignity, who help others for free, who live according to their conscience, who truly serve the spiritual world, ignoring material priorities. That is the kind of person you need to be, first of all, improving yourself. In a civilized society with the spiritual vector of development, everyone from childhood should be able to ignore thoughts from the animal nature, understand their dual nature, their own energy structure and its capabilities. A human must know that he is directly connected to the spiritual world, that there is one God and there should be no intermediaries at all in communicating with him. This is a sacrament of the two, man and God. It is necessary to create conditions in society so that new personalities that come into this world understand the primary meaning of life, to increase their spiritual power, to follow cultural and moral foundations that are natural for people, to be more humane and kind in their thoughts, words, and deeds, to perfect themselves internally, and, ultimately, to save their soul. We need to take into account the mistakes of the past and not lose the main spiritual reference points. In today's world, people forget one simple truth: the time of their lives flies very fast. They see a certain degree of freedom in achieving their material desires. In fact, this freedom is conditional, it is illusory. Man actually cannot possess anyone or anything in the material world, even if he conquers peoples or a significant territory in it and gains power over its many riches. He is born alone and dies alone. This world, for a human, is only an illusion of information, which creates conditions for affirmation of his dominant choice. In such a qualitatively new society, various spiritual self-improvement tools must be on record and available to the personality. If a person wants to use additional tools for his spiritual development, for instance, in the form of prayers, spiritual practices, meditation, and so on, he is more than welcome. This is his desire. But tools are just tools. They attune the attention, not unlike a tonometer, to a certain frequency, allow one for a moment to feel the other side, the other world, the world of God, to get experience, compare and understand the different, come in contact with one's soul through the deepest feelings, and feel its power. Returns to the familiar three-dimensional world again, in which he once again makes his choice each day. And here, it is very important what he will choose in the future, with this spiritual experience under his belt. Will the person want to qualitatively transform his nature and become a spiritual being, or will he be seduced by a temporary illusion from the animal mind and thus condemn his soul and personality to continued suffering? All this seems to be a small detail and only a result of the personal choice of a single individual. But the choice of each person adds up to the movement of a civilization as a whole, which depends on each choice. It all starts with the purity and sincerity of intentions of each individual in the society, his or her true inner choice, and a responsible approach to life, given its very limited term.